Hi there, it's Philip here, and it seems like it's the week for different backgrounds, different environments to do a vlog from, and what better place to do it than in this incredible, beautiful day. 2:15 in an afternoon, beautiful autumn afternoon. We're slowly making our way into winter, aren't we? It's a bit colder these days. And my beloved pizza oven behind me, which has served this family rather well in different events and parties as well. So welcome to my backyard and to this incredible day. Looks like it's going to continue for a few days yet as well. So I was just reflecting a little bit as a last in the last vlog. I mentioned that we got to the end of part one of the book of Revelation, kind of a two-part book that it's made into, and the end of Revelation chapter 11 brings us to the end of part one. And before kind of launching into part two, I'd been reflecting a little bit, I suppose, on this. Perhaps the reason why Revelation was written in the first place, if we were to put it as simply as this, it might be to encourage the believers to persevere during hardship and the difficulties of being a Christian in those early Roman days, to persevere and to continue to be this phrase that's used consistently throughout Revelation, to be faithful witnesses. And I've used that a lot because, of course, that's in the book a lot. But faithful witnesses, in a sense, is a term that needs a bit of unpacking, I suppose. And I'm not going to do a huge amount of that here, but perhaps just cause us to reflect a little bit again on that. That what does it mean to be a faithful witness? And it's like saying to be faithfully faithful. So some things to think about here. On just before we got on lockdown, I did an experiment. I think it's something we'd been talking about as an eldership. It's something that I know that we often think about as our practices as a church, and how we worship and our worship and community life. And David often asks, what really is church? And it's a good question, and one we reflect on. And with my love of music and what I'd been thinking of in that particular area of my life, the term hi-fi struck me as being a way in, or a metaphor to think about faith and myself and my life as a faithful witness to Christ. Now, hi-fi for most of you will probably relate to hi-fi systems, musical systems, things that you play your music on. It's not perhaps used so much these days when we're talking about the music that's on our phones, which is mostly what I think a lot of us carry our music on these days, or Spotify and other streaming music services. We don't talk so much about hi-fi, but it's an old term and still used a lot in different contexts. And what it talks about essentially is, so you have a band that goes into a studio and they're going to record their music. Now, the whole point of that recording studio setup is to create or capture the essence of that music and what it sounds like in that studio room. Capture it by recording it, and there'll be mics all around the room and set up with different amps, and set up on this for the singer, and all sorts of systems that people use in different ways that people will try and attempt this. But the goal is essentially the same: to capture as accurately as possible what happened in that studio and what those artists produced, capture it and then reproduce it, so that when we hear it in our own homes and in our cars and just walking the streets, it's as close to what was heard in the studio. Now, there's going to be always differences, of course, but that's the goal. Try and recreate it so that we hear what the artists really wanted us to hear. And hi-fi means high fidelity, which is to say as accurately as possible, with as much fidelity as possible. Lo-fi is if it's really rough and not a very accurate representation. It's it's a very low quality. Hi-fi is a very high quality. So that's why how we've always thought of it. It's hi-fi is a really good system, a really good sound system, so that we can hear the music clearly and hear as best as possible what was recorded. Now, high fidelity. Fidelity comes from a Latin word fide, which can be translated faithful or loyal. I don't know if you've ever heard the old name for dogs, Fido, which is given to dogs because they're one of the most faithful and loyal creatures. The faithful hound Fido. So the word fidelity comes from that. So it's high fidelity means to be as faithful or as loyal as possible to the original recording, to the original sound that the artists were trying to produce in the studio. Which of course gets me to that, back to this question of faith and faithful witness and faithfully being faithful. And thinking about myself on whether in what ways am I hi-fi and in what ways might I be a bit lo-fi as far as the way that I'm presenting Christ to the world. And so the experiment, that thinking led to a little experiment which I want to sort of see if this translates across this camera here, whether this is particularly hi-fi or not. So what I did is I found this is not particularly important part of the thing, but I found a packing slip from the book depository, something that I purchased, and I had this lying in my office, and I thought what I'll do is I'll photocopy this original, and then I'll take that photocopy and I'll photocopy from that, and I'll do that 10 times, and I'll see what I get. So here's part of that original, and that's what it looks like. And after 10 times, copying from the copy to the copy, this is what I ended up with. So I hope you can see the difference. I'll hold up the other one as a comparison again. So that's the 10th copy of a copy of a copy. And whoops, where are we? And here's the original. So can you see the differences? Oh, everything's mirror image, so I get it a bit wrong. So it's a couple of things I really noticed here. Well, the main takeaway here is that what is important and what is imperfect from the original has now the same value on the final copy of the copy. So what do I mean by that? Well, if you look at the original, the most important details probably is the barcode, and that's nice and clear on the original, but it's degraded a lot by the time we get to the final copy. Added to that, if you see these little dots here and further around here, they are tiny, almost imperceptible imperfections on the original. You might not have even noticed them when you were looking at the original first time, second time, third time round. But they've been exaggerated by the photocopying process until the point is that they are as dark as the barcode. They're from just a simple scan of looking at this picture of this copy of a packing slip. The imperfections, the static dots, are just as dark as the barcode. And the barcode is the important information, of course. But if you didn't know what was important on the page and we're just looking for, well, what is darkest is most important, then you would consider that those dots were just as important. And what also has happened to make those dots seem as valuable or as important as the important information is the degrading of the important information. That's become more pixelated, it's become more rough, and looks only as clear as the dots and the imperfections. So you end up with something that is hard to determine if you didn't already know how to interpret this. What was important and what wasn't, what was useful information and what was static and in fact getting in the way. So that got me thinking, right, about faith and this question that David proposed. What is church? And how we think about church will determine or affect what we think about what we should do as a church. And the concern, I suppose, or at least some of what he was reflecting on, and I think we often do, is what do we do that is no longer as in true keeping with what the spirit of the church was about? What do we do that is not as important as we think it's important? And what do we do that that is important but we don't do with the same degree of importance as it might have been? So that in a sense, our faithfulness as a church, our fidelity, the accuracy of our being together as a church is no longer as consistent or as clear as it might have been in the early days. And I think you possibly remember me saying that the early church, to those around them, which is a very religious, God-fearing culture that they were in, the early church and its practices were so unusual compared to the religious practices of the day that they were considered atheists. They didn't have temples. Sure, they did in Jerusalem, but wherever the church planted, they didn't build temples. They didn't hire priests and have hierarchy. They didn't have altars to sacrifice or any sacrificial systems at all. Now, they definitely did have practices, and they would have shared, probably would have had the kind of Passover and Easter type celebrations that we remember, and the celebrating the birth of Christ, and they would have had all sorts of subtle traditions within what they did that formed them as a community and formed them as worshippers. And of course, the key one of those would have been weekly a meal together, which they called communion. And if you read Corinthians, the first letter of Corinthians, when Paul addresses the matter of communion to the church there, it's really clear that what they're doing is having a meal. And Paul's criticism of them as a church around this key sacrament of communion is that they weren't, that the rich who already had plenty of food back home were sure they were providing a meal, but then they were actually eating most of the meal. And here's my cat coming in to say hi, and that's Tommy. The rich were using their influence to eat the meal and leaving the poor to go hungry again. Now the poor, again, also, they can't go home to get a meal like the rich can. And for some of them, this might have been the most significant meal they would have had in the week. They might have been that close to the bread line, that having the communion meal was a chance for them to have a decent feed at least one time a week. So the comments that Paul makes is in that context, and he's critical of the rich for being so callous toward the poor and for using their hierarchy and their power, which shouldn't exist in a church, which isn't based on hierarchy, and it's certainly not a privileging of the rich over the poor. It's quite the opposite. That they weren't understanding their faith tradition properly, and therefore weren't appropriately coming toward communion with the right attitude. So Paul had to address that matter then and say, your practices aren't faithful to the character of Jesus. So realign what you're doing so that the poor get a chance to have a decent meal, and the rich, you don't actually need to have anything. If anything, just have a small amount, because you can go home and have a full meal later. So make sure that the communion meal is a chance to celebrate your care for one another in the name of Christ. That would be one way to put it. And when I think about our communion scenario now, I think there's a lot of meaning in it, and I know a lot of us take meaning from the taking of communion. However, I would say it's probably getting more difficult to work out what does communion really mean in the way that we do it. Because you certainly wouldn't think it's a meal, would you? Not the amount of bread that we share or the amount of juice that's in the cup. There's by no means is there a meal there. And it was interesting to me that on the odd occasions when we've decided to not take communion because we're going to have a shared lunch, and I remember repitching that shared lunch as, this is our communion meal today. We're not going to take it as we normally do. We're going to have this. I have had some feedback on occasions, on several of those occasions, that some people were sad that we didn't take communion that day, which I find really interesting, right? It's a little bit like that packing slip scenario for me, where we have got to a point where we've copied and a copy of a copy of a copy, rather than going back to the original and going, what was that communion feast really all about? What was it trying to accomplish? What was its purpose? What did it achieve within the community of faith? We have, instead of, we're not always good at going back to those original founding principles and founding practices and getting back to what they were about, so that when it comes to changes, even one that was more alike to what that original communion shared lunch would have been like, we are so accustomed to the changes that the imperfections, or the things that don't matter as much, are as valuable as the things that do matter, and so we can't assess very easily whether we've done a good thing or a bad thing. We look at a very low-fi version of something, and there's still, the data that's important is still there. It's just hidden a lot more now, and I think that's probably where we get to with a lot of things, with our church practices and with our practices as individual Christians as well. That there are things that we think are really important to our faith that perhaps are not as important as we think, and things that we don't think of as being important that perhaps are more important than we realize. So this is the challenge. Now, I'm not really going to land on any place where to say, and here's what I want you to do. This is more a sort of a conversation and a discussion, a conversation starter, if you like, because, and here's my final thing, on Monday I met with, via Zoom, different pastors from across the Waikato region, and we just shared some of the reflections and observations of church life through the COVID-19 lockdown and what different churches have done and what they've observed. And there's some really good things that people have observed, and I'd say the same at Chapel Hill as well, that we can see the goodness and the solidity and the depth of faith among the Christians of our churches in the way that they've approached this difficult time. A lot of people have been very solid, had good reason to keep their faith solid and strong, and not a lot of wobbling, and indeed a number of people rising to the challenge, whether communicating with others, connecting with others, or even participating in different church practices depending on how the church was doing things in their particular context. But the other question was asked, well, what would we do? What are we going to do different? What do we think is good to carry forward? And what do we think we actually need to leave behind, that we have done it like this now, but we really don't want to continue like this? So lots of different reflections there, but the one that comes to mind for us relates to a statement that I heard, which I think it's great. So don't take me wrong here. It was passed to me, and I have no idea who made the comment, but it was, on our first Sunday, and maybe even more than that, we don't want to listen to Philip. We're going to want to really connect with one another, because this time of lockdown, of being separate from one another, has been costly. We've felt that lack, and I'm sure, and I know that wasn't a comment to denigrate teaching or preaching or me. It had nothing to do with me. It was more an emphasis on how important it is for us to be together and to connect with one another. And that is definitely a value of Chapel Hill. We talk about community a lot. And yet I think it's probably fair to say we're not always great at community, and we can improve, we can grow in fidelity there, if you like. We can become more community-minded, more mindful of one another, more mindful of the things that we're going through, more mindful of things to celebrate, more mindful of our different lives, and getting to know one another at a deeper level. And so I think that one of the positives that could well come out of this COVID-19 thing, that might make us more faithful to what it means to be a church of God, is a re-emphasis or a reawakening to the importance of human connection and how we might do that. And I suspect, and I certainly hope, that when we do meet together, there will be a deeper sweetness about that, about getting together and being with one another. And that will translate, I hope, into changing, or maybe improving practices and reawakening our love for being God's family, and the incredible gift and what a blessing it is that we have been placed in a family like this. So there's my thoughts, a little bit of a rambling reflection on fidelity and faithfulness, and a bit of a challenge to us individually and corporately to assess what we do looking back to Scripture. And that's obviously key, looking back to Scripture and listening to the voice of the Spirit, so that we're open to assessing what we do and how we go about our lives together, so that it might be consistent with the character and nature of our God revealed by Jesus Christ. Thanks for tuning in. I hope that you're having an awesome day and enjoying the sun as much as I am. From me and Tommy, God bless.